laughter and morning light and a pair of wide green eyes watching him from the edge of the couch. The youngest Russo girl perched there, staring at him with a mixture of interest and suspicion. 4 loud bodies came crashing suddenly into the room, a cacophony of limbs and noise. It was Saturday, and already the Russo children were running wild. Eli spent most of the time trying to stay out of their path, but it was hard in such a crowded house. "Weirdo," said one of the boys, knocking into him on the stairs. "How long is he staying?" asked another. "Don't be unchristian," warned Mr. Russo. "Gives me the creeps," said the oldest boy.
"What's wrong with you?"
demanded the youngest girl. "Nothing," answered Eli, though he wasn't sure if that was true.
"Then act normal,"
she ordered, as if that were such a simple thing.
"What does normal look like?"
he asked, at which point the girl made a small, exasperated sound and stormed away. Eli waited for someone to come and get him, take him away, though he didn't know where they would take him. But the day passed, and darkness fell, and he was still there. That first night was the only one he spent alone. They put him in the boys' room after that, a spare mattress tucked in one corner. He lay there, listening to the other boys sleep with a mixture of annoyance and envy, his nerves too fine-tuned to let him rest among the various sounds of movement. Eventually he got up and went downstairs, hoping to steal a few precious hours of stillness on the sofa. Mr. and Mrs. Russo were in the kitchen, and Eli heard them talking. "Something's not right with that boy." Eli hovered in the hall, holding his breath. "He's too quiet." Mrs. Russo sighed.
"He's been through a lot, Alan. He'll find his way."
Eli returned to the boys' room, climbed back into his bed. There, in the dark, the words repeated. Quiet. Weirdo. Creep. He'll find his way. Act normal. Eli didn't know what normal was, or even what it looked like, but he'd spent a lifetime studying his father's moods and his mother's silences, the way the air in the house changed like the sky before a storm. Now, he watched the way the Russo boys roughhoused, noted the fine line between humor and aggression. He studied the confidence with which the oldest, a boy of 16, moved among his younger siblings. He studied the guileless innocence the youngest played up to get what he wanted. He studied the way their faces twisted into a pantomime of emotions, like annoyance and disgust and anger. Most of all, he studied their joy. The way their eyes lit up when they were gleeful, the varying tones of their laughter, the dozen ways their smiles shone or softened, depending on the exact nature of their delight. Eli had never known there were so many kinds of happiness, let alone so many ways to express it. But his study was cut short when, just 2 weeks into his stay with the Russos, Eli found himself uprooted again, deposited with another family, in another house. Act normal, the Russo girl had said, and so Eli tried again, started fresh. It wasn't a perfect imitation, not by far, but it was an improvement. The children at this new house still called him names, but the names had changed. Timid, quiet, weirdo had been replaced by strange, curious, intense. Soon came another family, and another chance. Another opportunity to reinvent, to modify, to adjust aspects of that act. Eli tested his theater on the families as if they were an audience, and used their feedback, the immediate, constant feedback, to tweak his performance. Slowly, strange, curious, intense had been refined, honed into charming, focused, clever. Then something else changed. Another car pulled up and took him away. But this time it didn't drop him off with another of his father's flock. This time, it took him to family. The fifth home. Patrick Cardale did not believe in God. He was John's estranged nephew, the son of a dead aunt that Eli had never met. Patrick was a professor at a local college, married to a painter named Lisa. They didn't have children, no one for Eli to mimic, no curtain of normalcy or noise for him to slip behind. Eli sat on the sofa across from them, a captured audience, a solo act. "How old are you?" asked Patrick. 12? "Almost 13, said Eli. It had been more than 6 months since Pastor Cardale's accident. "I'm sorry it took us so long," said Patrick, hands between his knees. Lisa put a hand on his shoulder.
"We'll be honest, it wasn't an easy decision."
Patrick shifted. "I knew you'd been raised a certain way, and I knew I couldn't give you that. John and we didn't see eye to eye."
"Neither did we,"
said Eli. He realized he was making them uncomfortable, so he smiled, not too wide, just enough to let Patrick know that he was okay.
"Come on,"
said Lisa, rising.
"I'll show you to your room."
Eli rose to follow her.
"We can find you at church," she added,
leading him down the hall.
"If it's important to you."
But he didn't need a church, not because he'd given up on God, but because church itself was the one place Eli had never felt him. No, God had stood with Eli at the top of the cellar stairs, given him each of those families to learn from, led him here, to this house, and this couple, this new chance. His room, when they got there, was comfortable and clean. A double bed, a closet, a desk. A pair of framed pictures hung on the wall over the desk, anatomical drawings, one of a hand, the other a diagram of a human heart. Eli stopped before them, studying the lines, startled by the intricacy, the elegance.
"You can take those down if you don't like them,"
said Lisa.
"Make the space yours. Put up posters or whatever boys your age do."
Eli glanced toward her.
"How long am I staying?" Lisa's eyes widened in surprise. Her face was an open book. That was the phrase people used.
Eli had never really understood it until he looked at Lisa.
"As long as you want," she said. "This is your home now."
Eli didn't know what to say to that. He'd been living in increments of days, weeks, which wasn't really living, of course. Now, his future stretched before him, measured in months, years. Eli smiled, and this time, it almost felt natural.
Roman numeral 15. 4 years ago. Eon. Stell sank into his office chair and waited for the call. His office, like the rest of Eon, was composed of clean lines, spare and minimalist. 3 thin screens drew a semicircle over his desk, and a vast grid on the wall live-streamed footage of each hall, access point, cell. Eon's cells were state-of-the-art fiberglass cubes, each floating in the middle of its own concrete hangar. The majority of the screens on the wall were still dark, positioned as they were in half-completed wings, or looking onto empty cells. But on the central screen, Eli paced the confines of his unit like a lion, tracing the edges of its cage.
To think, none of this would have happened without Elliot Cardale. Eli Ever.
Stell took up a black business card, turned it absently between his fingers. The word Eon, ghosted in spot gloss, showed up only when it caught the light. Eon had been Stell's idea, yes, but it was at first a vague proposal, one motivated by his history with Vale and Cardale, by what he'd stopped, but also what he'd failed to do. By the fact that 10 years ago Stell had put Victor in jail and let Eli go free, and because of that choice, that failing to look beyond the obvious, to see through a single deceptive guise, 39 people had died. It haunted him, plagued him. There had to be a way, to find EOs, to contain them, maybe, one day, to use them. EOs were dangerous, yes, some catastrophically so, but what if, among the lost and the deranged, there were those who could be fixed, given purpose, made whole? What if death didn't change a person's nature, only amplified it? By that logic, a wounded soldier might still want to serve. That was the focus, the sharp point at the center of Stell's idea. A world where skilled EOs could help stop crimes instead of start them, and where the rest could be contained, kept from committing more atrocities. A short, bright ring signaled the incoming call. The curve of screens on Stell's desk lit up. Stell brushed his fingers through the air, accepting the call, and seconds later a conference room appeared in front of him. 5 stern figures seated around a long wood desk. The board of directors. 3 men and 2 women, all in dark suits, the standard uniform of government agencies and private ones alike. They looked like vague copies of each other. The same dark hair, the same narrow eyes, the same flat expressions.
"Director," said a man in charcoal, "do you care to explain why you removed a valuable test subject from the lab and fired one of our most prominent, not to mention valuable scientists?"
"He was dissecting an EO." The silence that followed wasn't loaded. On the contrary, it was empty. The members of the board stared at him as if he hadn't answered the question, as if they didn't see the problem. "Last time I checked," said Stell, knitting his fingers, "I was the director of this institution. Are personnel changes above my pay grade?"
"Of course not, Director,"
said a woman in navy.
"You have an intimate understanding of the needs and challenges on the ground. However—"
"Eon may be your operation," cut in a man in black, "but we are its bank. And as its bank," said the man in charcoal, "we need to know our money is being well spent, in the interest of national security." That last sentence, like an afterthought, as if the 5 wolves in dark suits weren't circling in search of profit.
"Haverty's methods may have been questionable,"
said the woman in navy,
"but his research was promising. As for your EO, his ability made him uniquely qualified to undergo that research. Now you have deprived us of both scientist and subject."
"Let's discuss the EO," chimed in a new voice, a woman in black. "Elliot Cardale, alias Eli Ever. What have you done with him?"
"He's been relocated to a cell in the containment unit."
"To what end?"
"To contain him," said Stell. "Eli Cardale killed nearly 40 people." A man in gray sat forward.
"They were almost all EOs, though, weren't they?"
"Is that supposed to make it better?" The man waved the concern away.
That simply means your subject already has a proven skill.
Killing EOs.
Tracking them down.
Isn't that the point of your organization?
Asked the woman in navy.
To find and contain EOs before they can cause harm.
It is, said Stell through gritted teeth. Then, said the man in black, I suggest you put him to use. The lights went down, and came back up, and Eli was still alone. A night passed, and no one came to collect him. No one dragged him from the cell. He wondered if this was what Victor's time in prison had felt like, after his arrest, the endless waiting, entirely alone. Eli leaned forward, elbows on his knees. He interlaced his fingers, but instead of praying, he stared over the tops of his knuckles at the farthest wall, and listened, straining his senses for any clues. He was met only by the dampened silence of nested space. Just going to sit around and wait, chided Victor. There again, haunting Eli. How complacent. Eli rose and went to the fiberglass divide, rapped his knuckles on the surface, then pressed his hands flat against it, testing the material. I assure you, said a familiar voice, the cell is stronger than it looks. The wall cleared, like a curtain dropping all at once from a window, and there, on the other side of the glass, stood Joseph Stell. The last time Eli had seen the cop was at the Falcon Price Project, standing over Victor's dead body, while a SWAT team dragged Eli away. Officer, he said. Actually, it's Director now. Congratulations, said Eli coolly. Director of what? Stell held out his hands. This place. Your new home. The Department of Extraordinary Observation and Neutralization. He stepped up to the glass. I think you'll admit it's quite an upgrade from your previous circumstances. And as director, I assume you were responsible for those two? Stell's expression darkened. I wasn't adequately informed of the lab's methods. Had I been, it wouldn't have been allowed. As soon as I found out you were extracted, and that branch of testing terminated. If it's any consolation, so is Haverty. Consolation, echoed Eli, splaying his fingers across the fiberglass. I should warn you, said Stell. If you try to strike any of these walls, a warning will go off and the surface will electrify. Try a second time, and, well, we both know it won't kill you, but it will hurt. Eli's hand fell away. How thorough? I underestimated you once, Mr. Cardale. I don't intend to do so again. I was never a danger to you, Director Stell. Wouldn't your energy and resources be better spent on EOs who represent a threat to the general public? Stell's mouth twitched into a grim smile. You killed 39 people. That we know of. You are a mass murderer. The true number was closer to 50, but Eli didn't say so. Instead he turned, surveying his cell. And what did I do to deserve such accommodation? Stell produced a simple manila folder and slid it through the slot in the fiberglass. Eli turned back and took it up, flicking through the pages. It was a profile, much like the ones the Merritt PD had developed under Eli's instruction. You possess a unique and proven skill set, said Stell. You are here to assist in the tracking and capture of other. Eli laughed, short and humorless. If you wanted me to help you hunt EOs, he sneered, tossing the file onto the table, you shouldn't have put me in a cell. Unlike you, we treat execution as a last resort. Half measures, then. Humane ones. Hypocrisy in action. Eli shook his head. What you're doing, what Eon is doing, is nothing but a pale version of my own work. So why am I the one in the cell? Eli stepped as close as the fiberglass would allow. Disagree with my methods, Stell. Doubt my motives. But you're a fool if you think what you're doing is different. The only difference between us is that you naively insist on preserving what I know should be destroyed. You want to pretend that capturing EOs is a mercy. To what end? So you can sleep easier without their blood on your hands? Or so that you can grow your collection of specimens and play God with their bodies? Because I played God once, Stell, and it did not end well. Eli rocked back on his heels. I spent 10 years trying to make amends for that, to undo the damage I wrought. Yes, I killed a great many EOs, but it wasn't out of cruelty or violence or spite. I did it to protect people, living, innocent humans, from the monsters I'd found in the dark. Are you so sure they're all monsters? Challenged Stell. Yes, he said forcefully. There had been a time when Eli thought himself exempt from that label. Now he knew better. EOs may look like humans, Stell, but they don't think or act like them. Victor would have enumerated any number of symptoms: diminished sense of consequence, lack of remorse, self-absorption, amplification of demeanor and aspect. But Eli said only, they have no soul. He shook his head. You want to save EOs. Save them from themselves. Put them in the ground where they belong. Unless that's your plan. I have no intention of helping. In answer, Stell set another folder in the fiberglass slot between, this one black. Eli caught a glance at the file. "Didn't you hear me?"
This isn't another dossier, said Stell. It's your other option.
Eli glimpsed his own name printed on the front of the file. He didn't reach for it. Didn't need to. He knew what it was. What it meant.
Take a day to think it over, said Stell. I'll be back tomorrow for your answer.
He retreated, and the wall went solid again in his wake, turning the cell back into a tomb. Eli gritted his teeth, and then he swiped the black folder from the tray and carried it to the table, where the thin manila file already waited. Eli sank into a chair and flicked back the cover. On top was an X-ray, black and white, seemingly innocuous. He flipped past and saw an MRI. The body lit up in red and blue and green. And then he turned the page again, and his throat constricted at the sight of the first photograph. A man's chest. Eli's chest, pried open by metal clamps to reveal ribs, lungs, a beating heart. Every pre-med student did dissections. Eli had done a dozen his freshman year. Peeled and pinned the skin of small animals out of the way to examine the organs beneath. The photos in the black folder reminded him of that. The only difference, of course, was that Eli had been alive. The pain itself was gone, but the memory of it etched along his nerves, echoed through his bones. Eli wanted to sweep the file from the table, tear it to shreds, but he knew he was being watched. He'd noted the cameras set into the ceiling, imagined Stell standing in some control room, a smug expression on his face. So Eli stayed seated, and turned through every page of the gruesome graphic record, studying every photograph, every diagram, every scrawled note, every aspect of torture laid out in sterile detail, memorizing the black folder, so that he would never have to look at it again. You're not blessed, or divine, or burdened. You're a science experiment. Maybe Victor was right. Maybe Eli was just as broken, just as damned as every other EO. It was true. He hadn't felt that presence the night he killed Victor. Hadn't felt anything like peace. But that didn't absolve him of his task. He still had a purpose, an obligation, to save others, even if he couldn't save himself. Roman numeral 16. 20 years ago. The fifth home. Eli ran his fingers over the cover of the book. It was massive and heavy, and every single page detailed the marvels and miracles of the human body.
"I thought we should get you tickets to a game," said Patrick. "But Lisa insisted."
"It's perfect," said Eli.
See,
said Lisa, shouldering Patrick.
he wants to be a doctor. You've got to start young.
"From ministry to medicine,"
mused Patrick.
"John must be rolling in his grave."
Eli laughed, an easy sound, practiced to perfection. The truth was he didn't see the two avenues as separate. Eli had seen God the day he arrived, in the drawings on his wall, saw him again now in the pages of this book, in the perfect fit of bones, the vast intricacies of the nervous system, the brain, the spark, like faith, that turned a body into a man. Patrick shook his head.
"What 15-year-old boy would rather have a book?"
"Would you rather I asked for a car?" asked Eli, flashing a crooked smile. Patrick clapped him on the shoulder. These days, Eli didn't flinch. His attention fell back to the anatomy textbook. Perhaps his interest wasn't strictly normal, but he could afford this small divergence. At 15, the personality he'd crafted was nearly perfect. The day after he arrived, Patrick and Lisa had enrolled him in school, and Eli had realized the hard way that a 6-month crash course in normalcy was a pale foundation of what he'd need to survive. But it was a big school, and Eli was a quick study. And soon, charming, focused, clever, had not only been cemented, they'd been joined by handsome, friendly, athletic. He ran track and field. He aced his classes. He had a winning smile and an easy laugh, and nobody knew about the scars on his back or the shadows in his past. Nobody knew that it was all an act, that none of it came naturally. Lisa's laughter rang through the house like bells. Eli could hear it over the classical music in his earbuds as he did his chemistry homework. A few moments later, Patrick knocked on the doorframe, and Eli hit pause.
You guys off?
"Yeah," said Patrick. "Show starts at 7, so we shouldn't be back late. Don't work too hard,"
says the professor to the student.
"Hey, studies show that variation is good for retention."
Come on,
called Lisa.
"I put money on the counter," said Patrick. "At least order a pizza. Steal a beer from the fridge."
"Will do," said Eli absently, already hitting play. Patrick said something else, but Eli didn't catch the words over the concerto. At 9, he finished his homework and ate leftovers at the kitchen counter. At 10, he went for a jog. At 11, he went to bed. And 15 minutes later, his cell phone rang, a number he didn't recognize, a voice he didn't know. "Is this Elliot Cardell?" said a man. A stillness formed in Elliot's chest. Not the kind he'd felt when he pushed his father down the stairs. No, this was colder, heavier. The weight of finding his mother floating in the tub, the exhaustion as he sank like a stone to the chapel floor. "I'm afraid," continued the man, "there's been an accident." Eli wondered if this was shock. He sat on a flimsy plastic chair, a social worker at his side, the doctor straight ahead, an officer looming like a shadow. The cops had come to the house, driven him to the hospital, even though there was nothing to see or do. Dead on arrival. On impact, according to the doctor.
"I'm sorry, son," said the cop.
God never gives us more than we can bear. Eli laced his fingers, bowed his head. It's up to us to find the purpose in the pain.
"The driver didn't survive," continued the cop. "Toxicology's still out, but we think he was drunk."
How did they die? Eli realized too late that he'd asked the wrong question. A shadow crossed the doctor's face. "I'm sorry," he said quickly. "I didn't. It's just, I'm going to be a surgeon one day. I want to save lives. I need to understand." He balled his hands into fists. "If you don't tell me, I'll lie awake wondering. I think I would rather know." The doctor sighed. "Patrick suffered a cervical fracture of C2 and C3, he said, touching the bones at the top of his own neck. Lisa sustained a massive concussion, which resulted in an intracranial hemorrhage. In both cases, it would have been nearly instantaneous." Eli was glad they hadn't suffered. "All right," he said. "Thank you." "They didn't name a guardian," said the social worker. "Do you know if there's someone you can stay with, until we get things sorted out?" "Yes," he lied, digging out his phone. "I'll call a friend." Eli rose and walked a little ways down the hall, but didn't bother dialing. There was no phone tree this time, and no point in pretending. Eli was popular, well-liked, but he had always been careful to keep a measure of distance. Too close and someone might see the seams in his facade, the subtle but constant effort of pretending. Better to be friendly, without being friends. Eli returned to the social worker and the cop. The doctor had left. "I need to get some things from my place," he said. "Could you drop me off there?" He let himself into the house, listened to the sound of the patrol car pulling away before he closed the door. He stood for several long seconds in the darkened hall, and then turned and slammed his fist into the wall. Pain flashed through Eli's hand, up his arm, and he hit the wall again and again until his knuckles split open and blood dripped down his wrist, and he could breathe. His legs folded under him, and Eli sank to the floor. After everything, he was alone again. God never gives us more than we can bear. Eli told himself there was a plan, even if he couldn't see it. There was a purpose to the pain. He stared down at his bloody hand. Stupid, he thought. It would be hard to hide from the inevitable social workers, the school, the 100 eyes bound to latch onto every misstep, every crack in his persona. Eli got up and went to the bathroom, rinsed the split knuckles under the sink, and bandaged his hand with calm precision and steady fingers. He met his gaze in the mirror and forced the lines of his face back into their proper order. And then Eli went to his room and began to pack. 19 years ago, the 6th and final home.
Here we go.
Eli stood in the doorway, holding a box of books. The room was simple, empty save for a window, a narrow bed, and a desk.
Bit sparse, I know,
said the landlord, who insisted he call her Maggie.
But the windows are double-glazed and the shower down the hall is hot.
She gave him a measuring look.
Awfully young to be living on your own, aren't you?
I'm emancipated, explained Eli. It had been the easiest route. He was nearly 16. Not many people wanted to take in a teenage boy, and Eli had no interest in becoming a ward of the state. His parents were dead. Patrick and Lisa were dead. The former had left him only scars, but the latter had left him some money. Not much, but enough to cover living expenses so he could focus on finishing high school, get into a good college. Thanks, Maggie, he said, crossing the threshold.
All right, Elliot. You let me know if you need anything.
The wood floor creaked under her feet as she ambled off, creaked under his as he set the box on the desk and unpacked, arranging his schoolbooks in a neat stack.
We are so sorry, Elliot,
the principal had said. We have counselors, added the dean of students. Let us know how we can help, echoed his teachers. Please, Eli had begged them each in turn. Don't tell anyone. Normal was such a fragile thing, so easily upset by even good intentions. And so, under the guise of him wanting to grieve in peace, they kept his secret. Eli unpacked the last 2 books, the battered Bible and the anatomy text. He set King James aside and sank into the chair, drawing the textbook closer. It's up to us, he thought, to find the purpose in the pain. Eli opened the heavy tome and paged through until he found the drawings of the head and neck, the tracery of the brain, the delicate column of the spine. Find the purpose. He began to take notes. Roman numeral 17. 4 years ago. Eon. When Stell returned the next day, Eli didn't look up. He kept his head bowed over the file he was studying, had been studying for the better part of the night.
I see you've decided to cooperate.
Eli gathered the papers back into a shallow stack. I need a computer, he said.
Absolutely not,
said Stell. Eli rose from the chair and carried the file to the fiberglass divide. I spent months researching my targets, confirming their abilities, tracking their movements. He let the file fall from his fingers, papers sloughing to the floor. You want me to do the same work from inside a concrete box, with nothing but basic information? This, he said, gesturing to the pages at his feet, is not enough.
It's what we have.
Then you're not looking hard enough, snapped Eli. He turned his attention to a photo on the floor. Tabitha Dahl, he said, scanning the paper. 19. College athlete. Young, social, active, adventurer. Suffers a massive cardiac event due to an allergic reaction while hiking. Friend is able to resuscitate her. She makes it to a hospital. And then, she disappears. Parents file a missing persons report 2 weeks ago. Eli looked up. Where would she go? How would she get there? Why is there nothing here about the friend she was with? How did she think and feel in the direct aftermath of her accident?
How are we supposed to obtain that kind of information?
Asked Stell. Eli threw up his hands. She's 19. Start with social media. Hack the texts she sent to friends. Get into her life. Get into her head. An EO isn't just the product of their catalyst. They are the product of the person they were before. The circumstances, but also the psyche. I can help you find Tabitha Dahl. With the right insight, I can probably make a decent guess as to her power, but I can't do any of that with 5 pieces of paper. A long silence followed. Eli waited patiently for Stell to break it. He did.
I'll get you a computer, he said, but access will be restricted, and the system will be twinned. I will see everything you search as you search it. And the moment you go off book, you will lose more than just your tech privileges. Are we clear?
I could do more than postulate, said Eli, kneeling to retrieve the papers. If you let me out...
Mr. Cardale, said Stell, I want to make something very clear. You can help us from inside this cell, or from inside a lab, but you will never, ever see the outside of this facility again.
Eli rose to his feet, but the director was already walking away. Roman numeral 18. 17 years ago. Haverford College. Eli made his way across campus, his collar up against the fall chill. Haverford was a good school, not the best, but certainly the best he could afford, and close enough to commute from the boarding house. It was also massive, sporting a population that could rival most towns, and a campus so large that 2 months in he was still discovering buildings. Maybe that was why he hadn't seen the chapel sooner. Or maybe until now the trees had simply hidden it, red and gold leaves obscuring the classic lines, the simple spire, the sloping white roof. Eli's steps slowed at the sight of it, but he didn't turn around. The pull was subtle but persistent, and he let himself be drawn to the steps. He hadn't set foot inside a church in years, not since God became more personal. Now, as he stepped through the doors, the first thing he saw was the stained glass. Red and blue and green light dancing on the floor, and there, before the window, a stone cross. His palms began to tingle. Eli closed his eyes, willing back the memory of a deep voice, the whistle of the leather belt. "Amazing, isn't it?" said an airy voice. Eli blinked and glanced sideways, and saw a girl, slim and pretty, with wide brown eyes and honey blonde hair. "I've never been religious," continued the girl, "but I love the look of the buildings. You?" "I'm not big on the buildings," he said with a wry smile, "but I've always been religious." She pouted, shook her head. "Oh, no. It will never work between us." The false sadness broke back into a smile. "Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt. You just looked sad." Did I? Eli must have slipped, let the truth show through. But in an instant he'd recovered, and turned the full force of his attention and his practiced charm on the girl. "Were you studying me instead of the building?" Light danced in the girl's eyes. "I'm more than capable of admiring both." She held out her hand. "I'm Charlotte." He smiled. "Eli." The bells rang once around them, and Eli held out his hand. "Have you had lunch?" Maggie had appeared in the doorway of Eli's room the week before, a basket of laundry on her hip.
It's Friday night, Elliot.
"And?"
And you're sitting in here doing calculus.
"Biology," he'd corrected. Maggie had shaken her head.
All this work and no fun for a boy your age. It's not normal.
That word, normal. The center line of his calibration. Eli had looked up from his homework. "What should I be doing?" he asked. one eyebrow raised to hide the earnestness of the question.
Go to parties, said Maggie. Drink cheap beer, make bad choices, date pretty girls.
He leaned back in his chair. Do pretty girls count as bad choices? Or are those two separate things? Maggie rolled her eyes and walked away, and Eli turned back to his paper. But he'd taken the words to heart. He'd gone to 1 or 2 frat parties, plastered on a lazy smile, and sipped awful beer, which honestly felt like a bad choice. But now, he had Charlotte. A relationship, Eli had learned, was a universal shorthand for normal, a societal stamp of approval. Dating Charlotte Shelton in particular was more like a gold seal. She was old money, the breeding so deep she didn't even notice it lining her every seam. She was cheerful and pretty and spoiled. She lived in the school dormitories, but only because she wanted an authentic college experience. Not that that desire for authenticity extended much beyond a single twin bed in a communal hall. Charlotte came to Eli's boarding house once and only once, and on her insistence. She knew he was an orphan, a word that seemed to generate in her an intense protective instinct. But the threadbare truth wasn't as romantic. He'd seen the pity masquerading as sympathy.
I don't love you for your stuff, she'd insisted. I have enough stuff for the both of us.
But after that, they didn't share a life. Charlotte just pulled Eli into hers. And he let her. It was easy. It was simple. She adored him. And he enjoyed the attention. Charlotte liked to say they were a perfect fit. Eli knew they weren't. But only he could see the jagged sides, the empty spaces.
How do I look?
She asked as they climbed the steps to her parents' house, mansion, for Thanksgiving, sophomore year. Stunning, said Eli automatically, pairing the word with a wink. Charlotte fixed his tie. She ran her fingers through his dark hair, and he let her, his own hand grazing the bottom of her chin, tipping her face up for a kiss.
Don't be nervous,
she whispered. Eli wasn't. The door swung open, and he turned, half expecting to see a butler, a grim old man in coattails, but instead he found an elegant, older version of Charlotte. You must be Eli, said the woman brightly, as a slim, stern man in a well-tailored suit appeared at her back. Thank you for having me, said Eli, holding out a pie. Of course, said Mrs. Shelton warmly. When Charlotte said you didn't have plans, we insisted.
Plus,
said Mr. Shelton, shooting Charlotte a look.
It's about time we met the boy our girl's been so taken with.
They started down the hall, Charlotte and her mother arm in arm.
Eli,
said Mr. Shelton, putting a hand on his shoulder.
Why don't I give you a tour while the ladies catch up?
It wasn't a question. Of course, said Eli, falling in step behind the man, who led him through a pair of doors into a private study.
This, he said, is really the only room that matters.
He opened a cabinet and poured himself a drink.
I can see why Charlotte likes you,
he said, leaning back against his desk.
She's always had a weakness for charity cases, especially handsome ones.
Eli stilled, his easy manner stiffening a fraction. Sir, if you think I'm with Charlotte for her money or her station...
The truth doesn't matter, Mr. Cardale. Only the optics. And they don't look good. I've done my homework on you. So much tragedy. You handle it with poise. While I admire how far you've come, the fact is, you're tracking mud into my home.
Eli's teeth clicked together. We can't shape our past, he said. Only our future. Charlotte's father smiled.
Well put. And that's what I'm offering you. A bright future. Just not with my daughter. I've seen your grades. You're a smart young man, Elliot. Ambitious, too, Charlotte tells me. You want to be a doctor. Haverford is a decent college, but it's not the best. I know you got into other schools. Better schools. I assume you couldn't afford them.
Eli stared, amazed. He was being bribed. Mr. Shelton pushed off the desk.
I know you care about my daughter. Hell, you might even think you love her.
But Eli didn't. If Mr. Shelton was better at reading people, or if Eli hadn't made himself so hard to read, he might have seen the simple truth. That Eli didn't need persuading. That Charlotte Shelton had always been, for him, a vehicle. A way to move through the world on an upward trajectory. What her father was now offering, if he was truly offering it, was a true chance for meaningful change. A great gain for a minor loss. But what came next was a delicate maneuver. Mr. Shelton, started Eli, contorting his face with an aspect of tightly controlled defiance. Your daughter and I... The man held up a hand.
Before you play the noble card and insist you can't be bought, remember that you are both very young, and love is fickle, and whatever you have with Charlotte might feel real, but it won't last.
Eli exhaled and looked down, as if ashamed. Let his features settle into a semblance of resignation. What would you have me do, sir?
Tonight? Nothing. Enjoy your dinner. In a few days, break things off. Pick one of those better schools, Chester or Lockland. Transfer. The tuition won't be a problem.
"Boys," called Mrs. Shelton from the kitchen. "Turkey's ready." Mr. Shelton clapped Eli on the shoulder.
Come on, he said cheerfully. I'm starving.
Dad,
warned Charlotte when they met her in the dining room.
did you put him through the ringer?
Just a little.
Mr. Shelton kissed his daughter on the cheek.
It's my duty to put the fear of God into whoever you bring home.
She turned her warm brown gaze on Eli.
I hope he wasn't being too rough on you.
Eli laughed softly and shook his head. Not at all. They took their seats, the table falling to easy conversation, so much spoken, so little said, as they passed platters and bowls. And as Eli and Charlotte walked back to their car that night, she slipped her arm through his.
Everything okay?
Eli glanced back at the front door, where Mr. Shelton stood watching. Yes, he said, kissing her temple. Everything's perfect. Roman numeral 19. 2 years ago. Eon. Eli ran his fingers along the shelf where he kept the old files. His own black folder sat like a stain at the edge of the row, a punctuation mark shifted to fit the growing sentence. 19 EOs tracked, hunted, captured, over a period of less than 2 years. Not bad, considering his limitations. Eli had insisted on keeping the old folders, telling Stell that past work would inform future cases. It was a partial truth. There were indeed patterns between EOs, shared traits, the same shadow cast over different faces. But the larger truth was simple. Eli found the markers satisfying. Not as satisfying as wrapping his hands around an EO's throat, feeling a pulse falter and still beneath his fingers. But an echo of that old calm still accompanied each closed case, the pleasant sense of things askew being set right. There was another facet to the collection. A grim truth laid bare in the sheer number of folders. What have we done? Eli muttered to himself. But it was Victor who answered. What makes you think we did anything? He looked up and saw the thin blonde ghost leaning back against the fiberglass wall. The number of EOs, said Eli, gesturing to the shelf. It's skyrocketed over the last decade. What if we did something? What if we tore something in the fabric of the world? What if we set something in motion? Victor rolled his eyes. We are not gods, Eli. But we played God. What if God played God? Victor pushed off the wall. What if EOs were part of his plan? What if these people, the ones you've spent your life slaughtering, were supposed to come back the way they did? What if you've been attempting to undo the very work of that higher power you worship? Don't you ever wonder if it's our fault? Victor tipped his head. Tell me, is it blasphemy or simply arrogance taking credit for God's work? Eli shook his head. You've never understood. Footsteps sounded nearby. The wall went clear. Who are you talking to? Asked Stell. Myself, muttered Eli, waving Victor's ghost away like a wisp of smoke. I've been thinking more about that electrokinetic teen. He looked up. Stell was dressed for field work, his broad frame cinched into a reinforced black suit. How did the extraction go? Asked Eli, managing to keep most of the disdain out of his voice. He'd spent 2 weeks researching the EO. Helen Andreas, 41, with the ability to disassemble and rebuild structures with a single touch. Eli had given Eon's agents as much insight as he could, considering the confines of his situation. Not well, said Stell darkly. Andreas was dead when we got there. Eli frowned. EOs, despite their destructive tendencies, rarely veered toward suicide. Their sense of self-preservation was too strong. Was it an accident? Not likely, said Stell, holding a photo up to the fiberglass. In it, Andreas lay on the ground, blood pooling beneath her, and a small dark circle burrowed into her forehead. Interesting, said Eli. Any leads? No. Stell hesitated. There was something he wasn't saying. Eli waited him out. After a long moment, the man finally went on. This wasn't an isolated incident. 2 months ago, another suspected EO was found in the same way, in the basement of a club. Stell slid both pages through the slot. Will Connolly. We were still monitoring him, since we didn't have enough data to construe the exact nature of his ability and assess his priority level, but we had suspected it was regenerative. Obviously not a power as efficient as your own, but something like it. At the time, we assumed his death was a one-off, a run-in with the wrong people, someone to whom he owed a debt. Now, once his chance, twice. Coincidence, said Eli. Collect a third and you have a pattern. He looked up from the paper. The weapon? Unregistered. Keep the ballistics on file anyway. If he or she is actively hunting EOs, it's only a matter of time before they strike again. In fact, continued Eli, pull every killing that matches this style of execution over the last... Eli considered. 3 years. 3. That's an oddly specific number. And it was. 3 years. That was how long Eli had been at Eon. That was how long he'd been out of work. If there had been another hunter during his tenure, he would have known, which meant someone new had taken his place. Roman numeral 20. 16 years ago. Laughlin University. Eli arrived at Laughlin nearly a week before the start of the spring semester. He hadn't picked just any school. If Charlotte's father was picking up the tab, Eli intended to stretch the bill. Laughlin was one of the best-ranked programs in the country. Now he crossed the intimate campus, savoring the quiet stretches of lawn. It was a solid week before classes were due to start, and the place was luxuriously empty. But his heart sank when he reached the dorms. He'd been hoping for a solo suite. Instead, he found a different setup. 2 desks, 2 beds, 1 window halfway between them. One of the beds was empty. On the other, a lean figure had stretched out, one arm behind his head, the other holding up a book. At the sound of Eli's approach, the book fell away, revealing a slim face, wolfish blue eyes, and lank blonde hair. "You must be Elliot." "Eli," he corrected, setting his backpack on the floor. The other boy swung his legs off the bed and stood. He was an inch or two taller than Eli, but all angles, edges. "Victor," he said, slipping his hands into his pockets. "Vale." Eli cracked a smile. "Name like that, you should be a superhero." Victor gestured down at himself. He was dressed in black jeans and a black polo. "Can you really see me in spandex?" The blue eyes flicked toward Eli's single suitcase, the box balanced on top. "You travel light?" Eli nodded at Victor's own side of the room. "You came early." Victor shrugged. "Family is best in small doses." Eli wasn't sure how to answer that, so he said nothing. The silence stretched between them, and then Victor cocked his head in a lupine way and said, "Are you hungry?" Victor speared another piece of broccoli. "So what are you studying?" They were sitting in a large dining hall on campus, the restaurant stations along the wall, each a capsule of a food culture. "Pre-med," answered Eli. "You too." Victor stabbed a strip of beef. "And what brings you to the discipline?" His eyes flicked up and Eli felt exposed. It was unsettling the way that pale gaze bored into him. Not curious so much as cutting. Eli looked down at his own food. "Same as most," he said. "I guess I felt a calling." "You?" "It seemed like an obvious fit," said Victor. "I've always been good at math and science. Anything that can be distilled down into equations, cause and effect, absolutes." Eli twirled pasta on his fork. "But medicine doesn't adhere to absolutes. Life isn't an equation. A person is more than the sum of their parts." "Are they?" asked Victor. His expression was steady, his voice flat. It was maddening. Eli was so used to disarming people, coaxing them into feeding him emotional cues, giving him something to play against. But Victor showed no interest in playing. "Of course," pressed Eli. "The parts themselves, muscle, organ, bone, blood, make a body, not a person. Without a divine spark, without a soul, they are only so much meat." Victor clicked his tongue in disapproval. "You're religious, then?" "I believe in God," said Eli steadily. "Well," said Victor, nudging away his plate, "you can live in the heavens. I'll take the earthly sphere." A girl appeared, dropping into the seat beside Victor. "What have we here?" She mussed his fair hair with an ease clearly born of habit. Interesting. Victor didn't strike Eli as the type to welcome casual contact, but he didn't pull away, only favored her with a bored smile. "Angie," said Victor, "meet Eli." She flashed him a smile, and Eli felt like a mirror turned toward the sun, relieved to have a source of light he could reflect. "We were just discussing God's place in medicine," said Victor. "Care to weigh in?" "I'll pass." She plucked a piece of broccoli from his plate. "It's rude to steal food." "You never finish anything. Didn't your parents teach you to eat your vegetables?" "No," said Victor blandly. "They told me to tap into my inner psyche and realize the truths of my potential. Vegetables never really came up." Angie shot Eli a conspiratorial glance. "Victor's parents are self-help gurus." "Victor's parents," said Victor, "are hacks." Angie laughed, a small, affectionate sound. "You're such a weirdo sometimes." "Only sometimes?" asked Victor. "I'll have to try harder." Those blue eyes flicked to Eli. "Normal is overrated." Eli tensed, a small inward clenching that didn't reach his face. Normal is overrated. Spoken like someone who didn't have to work so hard at it, who hadn't needed normal to survive. Victor cleared his throat. "Angie here is the brightest light in our engineering department." She rolled her eyes. "Victor's too proud to fish for praise, but he's top of the pre-med class." "But you haven't heard," said Victor soberly. "Eli here is going to give me a run for my money." Angie eyed him with newfound interest. "Is that so?" Eli smiled. "I'll do my best." Roman numeral 21. 2 years ago. Eon.
You were right, said Stell.
Eli rose from his cot. Don't sound so disappointed.
We pulled the execution-style killings, then ran those deaths through our system to see if any of them had EO markers.
Stell fed a piece of paper through the slot in the wall.
Meet Justin Gladwell.
Eli took it, staring down at the sparsely detailed profile, the mugshot of a man in his 30s with a 2-day-old shadow.
Gunned down nearly a year ago. Abilities unknown. He wasn't even on our radar.
They're outpacing you, said Eli, spreading the 3 profiles on his table. Justin Gladwell, Will Connolly, Helen Andreas. Congratulations. You appear to have a new hunter.
And you, said Stell, appear to have a copycat.
Eli bristled a little. He didn't care for the idea of a surrogate. No, he said, considering the series of corpses. I would have tailored their deaths to suit. Would have made it look organic. This person, he rapped his fingers on the table, is preoccupied by something else.
What do you mean?
I mean, said Eli, that the killer clearly sees the executions as necessary, but I doubt it's their sole objective.
We need to find this person as soon as possible, said Stell.
You want me to hunt a hunter? Stell raised a brow.
Is that going to be a problem?
On the contrary, said Eli. I've been waiting for a challenge. He crossed his arms, studying the pictures. One thing's almost certain.
What's that?
Your hunter is an EO. Stell stiffened.
How do you know?
Well, I don't know, said Eli. I can only hypothesize. But what are the odds of an ordinary human successfully executing 3 distinct EOs without the slightest signs of resistance? Eli held Gladwell's photograph up to the fiberglass. A single, consistently positioned point-blank headshot, in all 3 cases. A level of accuracy that means one of 2 things. Either the shooter is an expert marksman, or the victims didn't put up a fight. Blood spray suggests they were conscious and upright when they were shot, which means they simply stood there. Do you know many ordinary people who could convince or compel a person to go so willingly to their death? Eli didn't wait for an answer. He shook his head, studying the pictures, his thoughts turning. 1 week, 2 months, 9 months. These killings are far apart, he mused, which suggests that either your hunter isn't very good at finding EOs, or they're not looking for all EOs.
You think they're targeting specific people?
Or specific abilities, said Eli.
Any ideas?
Eli steepled his fingers. Determining an EO's abilities post-mortem was an impossible task. Abilities were hyper-specific, informed not only by the way in which the EO died, but also by their reason for wanting to live. He could speculate, but Eli hated speculating. It was dangerous and inefficient. Educated guesswork was still guesswork, not a substitute for first-hand experience. Paper clues could only tell you so much. Look at Sydney and Serena Clarke. The same near-death experience, a deep plunge in a frozen lake, resulting in 2 wildly disparate abilities. People were individual. Their psychology was specific. The trick, then, was to aim for vague shapes, focus only on the outlines, the broadest conditions, and collect enough of those that he could find the pattern, the picture. Give me everything you can on these 3, he said, sweeping his hand over the photos. They may be dead, but that doesn't mean they don't still have secrets to tell. Eli pointed at a box by Stell's feet. What are those? Stell nudged it with his shoe.
These, he said, are all the execution-style killings that fit the hunter's MO, but not the EO profile.
Humans. Of course. He hadn't considered that the hunter's scope might go beyond EOs. But that was because his own hadn't. What a careless assumption. Can I see them? The box was too big for the fiberglass cubby, so Stell had to feed the papers through, a handful at a time.
What are you thinking?
Stell asked as Eli set the ream of paper on the table. The dots floated in his mind, shifting as he tried to find the lines between them. There's a pattern here, said Eli. I haven't found it yet, but I will. Roman numeral 22. 15 years ago. Lockland University. To see a world in a grain of sand. Thunder rumbled in the distance, the clouds flushing blue. It was the start of senior year, and after unpacking, they'd gone up on the roof to watch the storm roll in. And heaven in a wildflower, continued Eli. He lifted his palm until it seemed to rest just beneath the lightning. Hold infinity in the palm of your hand. Honestly, Eli, said Victor, perching on one of the folding chairs that scattered the makeshift patio. Spare me the scripture. Eli's hand fell away. It's not the Bible, he said testily. It's Blake. Get some culture. He swept the bottle of scotch away from Victor. And the point holds. There is no harm in seeing a creator behind the creation. There is when you purport to study science. Eli shook his head. Victor didn't understand, would never understand, that it wasn't a matter of faith or science. The two were inextricable. Eli took a cautious sip from the stolen bottle and sank into a second chair as the storm crept closer. It was their first night back, the first night in their new shared apartment. Victor had spent his summer avoiding his parents on some remote family vacation while getting a head start on organic chemistry. Eli had spent his at Lockland, interning under Professor Lynn. He cut a sideways glance at his friend who was sitting forward, elbows on his knees, his attention seemingly transfixed on the distant lightning. Initially, Victor had presented a dilemma. Eli Cardale's persona, so carefully constructed over the last decade, found little audience with his sober new roommate. There was no need for a steady smile, affability, the practiced ease. There was no point to them, not when Victor seemed so utterly disinterested. No, disinterested was the wrong word. Victor's attention was constant, acute, but the more charming Eli tried to be, the less Victor responded to it. In fact, he seemed annoyed by the effort, as if Victor knew it was just that, an effort, a show. Eli found himself culling the unnecessary trappings, trimming his persona down to the essentials. And when he did that, Victor warmed, turned toward Eli, like a face toward a mirror. Like to like. It frightened and thrilled Eli, to be seen, and to see himself reflected. Not all of himself, they were still so different, but there was something vital, a core of the same precious metal glinting through the rock. Lightning flashed arterial lines of blue over the rooftop, and seconds later the world around them shook with a concussive force. Eli felt the tremor through his bones. He loved storms. They made him feel small, a single stitch in a vast pattern, a drop of water in a downpour. Moments later, the rain began to fall. In seconds, the first drops became a downpour. "Shit," muttered Victor, springing up from his seat. He jogged toward the roof door. Eli rose but didn't follow. Within seconds he was soaked through. "You coming?" shouted Victor over the rain. "You go ahead," said Eli, the downpour erasing his voice. He tipped his head back and let himself be swallowed by the storm. An hour later, Eli padded barefoot across the apartment, dripping rainwater in his wake. Victor's door was closed, the lights out. After reaching his room, Eli peeled off his soaked clothes and sank into his chair as the storm faded beyond the windows. 2 a.m, classes starting the next day, but sleep still eluded him. His cell phone sat on the desk, a handful of texts from Angie, but Eli wasn't in the mood for that, and anyhow, she was probably asleep by now. He ran a hand through his damp hair, slicking it back, and tapped his computer awake. Something stuck with him from the roof, the image of the lightning in his palm. Eli had spent the better part of the summer studying electromagnetism in the human body, the literal and metaphorical spark of life. Now, drifting in that exhausted early hours space, the darkened room and the artificial light of the laptop keeping him conscious if not fully awake, his fingers slid over the keyboard, and he began to search. For what, he wasn't exactly sure. One screen, one page, one site gave way to another, Eli's attention wandering between articles and essays and forums like a mind lost in a dream. But Eli wasn't lost. He was just trying to find the thread. He'd encountered a theory some weeks before on another insomniac night. Over the last month, it had grown roots, fed on his focus. Eli still didn't know what made him click that first link. Victor would have blamed idle curiosity or fatigue, but in Eli's trance-like state it felt eerily familiar. A hand resting over his own. A blessing. A push. The theory Eli had discovered was this: that sudden extreme trauma could lead to a cataclysmic, even permanent shift in physical nature and ability. That, through life or death trauma, people could be rewired, remade. It was pseudoscience at best. But pseudoscience wasn't automatically wrong. It was simply a theory that hadn't been adequately proven. What if it could be? After all, people in duress did extraordinary things, claimed feats of strength, moments of heightened ability. Was the leap so extreme? Could something happen in that life or death moment, that tunnel between darkness and light? Was it madness to believe? Or arrogance to not? The page loaded, and Eli's heart quickened as he stared at the word across the top of the screen. Extraordinary. Roman numeral 23. 1.5 years ago. Eon. Eli knelt on the cell floor, a dozen pages spread before him. He'd narrowed the massive stack of killings to 30, and then 20, and now, at last, to 6. Malcolm Jones, Theodore Goslin, Ian Housebender, Amy Tao, Alice Clayton, Ethan Barrymore. 3 drug dealers, 2 doctors, and a pharmacist. He slipped the first 3 pages through the slot. Run the ballistics in these against your executed EOs. Stell turned through the papers.
There are 100 gang and cartel killings in this file. Why these 3?
The magician doesn't reveal his secrets. said Eli blandly.
And you're not a magician. You're a murderer.
Eli sighed. How could I forget? He nodded at the massive stack from which he'd called the 6 names. There are 107 gang and cartel killings in there, to be exact, 83 of which we can rule out because they don't fit the clean point-blank execution model I requested. Of the remaining 24, 14 had records for specializing in illegal weapons, 10 in pharmaceuticals. Given the fact that your target has used the same gun for each and every execution, I decided to assume this wasn't about acquiring weapons. We can narrow the list down even further, because Jones's, Gosling's, and Housebender's executions all involved other victims, which, in addition to furthering my theory that the man you're looking for is using a supernatural method of compulsion on his victims, negates the need for multiple samples from each scene, rendering 3 out of the original 10.
You're sure it's a man?
I'm not sure of anything, said Eli, but the odds favor a male killer. Female killers are rarer, and they tend to prefer more hands-on methods.
And you think he's after drug dealers? Asked Stell.
Eli shook his head. I think he's after drugs. He retrieved the other 3 profiles from the floor. My theory is that your killer is either an addict or very sick, which brings me to these. Amy Tao, Alice Clayton, and Ethan Barrymore. The first 2 are doctors. The third is a pharmacist. Stell paced beyond the fiberglass wall.
And the dead EOs? How do they factor in?
I stand by my theory that our hunter was, and probably still is, targeting specific abilities. Andreas's was destructive, but also restorative. Connolly's regenerative.
Which supports your theory that he's sick.
There was, thought Eli, a grudging respect in Stell's voice. It's still only a theory, he demurred. Let's start by confirming the ballistics. The results came back 2 days later. Alice Clayton and Malcolm Jones, a doctor and a drug dealer, added to the tally of 3 dead EOs. Eli's picture was growing, but it was still missing something. He kept coming back to the gun. Their hunter was methodical, precise. He had to know that varying the style of execution would have helped cover the trail, and yet he'd chosen to maintain a single technique. There were reasons people adhered to such a pattern. Sometimes it was a signature, other times a matter of comfort or precision. But in this case, Eli had a feeling that the killer didn't want to get their hands dirty. Shooting was cold, efficient, and distant. But it was also clean, sterile. It could be done at a distance, with no risk of biological data at the scene. The killer's choice of weapon, despite the drawbacks of pattern, suggested they cared more about maintaining their own anonymity than hiding the trail of bodies, which in turn suggested that the killer's DNA was already in the system. An EO who was known to authorities. Eli's pulse quickened as pieces clicked together in the back of his mind. It was madness, irrational, impulsive. But Eli felt again that gentle pressure at his back, guiding him forward as he booted the computer and started searching for strange or sudden deaths in the practicing medical field. Eli spent the next 48 sleepless hours skimming every database and obit and news story. He knew he was making leaps instead of strides, but the ground was smooth and sloped beneath his feet. So instead of catching himself, Eli let gravity do the work. And then, finally, he found an obituary for Dr. Adam Porter, a leading neurologist discovered dead after hours at a private practice. It had been a heart attack, according to the coroner's report, but not at his desk, or on the way to his car, or safely at home. No, the body had been found on the hospital linoleum floor, next to a smoking MRI, its power blown. A freak accident. A massive current. The patient records from that night were missing, a neat hole carved out in a busy schedule, but Eli could read the outline by the edges it left behind. He knew the shape. He'd seen it before. Angie's body, twisted on the floor of the lab at Lockland, her back arched, mouth open, the last seconds of her life immortalized by pain. A heart attack, they'd said. A freak accident. A massive current. At the center of both, an EO with the skill to hunt, the ability to manipulate his victims' bodies. Someone already in the system, because they were supposed to be dead. I killed you, muttered Eli. Victor appeared again, as if summoned, cold blue eyes and a cunning smirk. You did? Then how? Do you really need to ask? Eli clenched his teeth. Serena Clarke. Serena had insisted on dispatching her little sister herself. Obviously, her resolve had wavered. Sydney was still alive. The girl who had a nasty habit of bringing people back. And of bringing EOs back wrong, too. Eli had seen it for himself when Sydney resurrected one of his prior kills, sent him back like a toy on the fritz, a note from Victor in hand. I made a friend. Now Eli got to his feet and looked up into the nearest camera. Stell? He asked, first quietly, and then louder. A cool voice responded via the intercom. The director is unavailable. When will he be back? He demanded. But the voice didn't answer. Eli bristled, He needed to see Stell, needed to look him in the eyes, ask him how he could be so stupid, ask him why he didn't burn the body. He looked around for something to use, some way to get the director's attention. But everything was bolted down. Except, of course, for him. He slammed his fist into the fiberglass wall. There was a low tone as the walls began to charge.
"Inmate,"
ordered the disembodied voice.
"stand down."
Eli did not. He hit the fiberglass a second time. An alarm went off, and an instant later, a burst of electricity shot up Eli's arm and sent him staggering backward, his pulse losing rhythm for a single measure before it settled. He started toward the wall a third time, but before his fist connected, the lights cut out, and Eli was plunged into absolute black. The sensory deprivation was so sudden, the darkness was so absolute, Eli felt like he was falling. He reached out to brace himself and stumbled, searched several seconds for the metal chair before sinking into it to wait. Why didn't you burn the body? Why didn't you? But as Eli sat in the dark, playing the question over and over in his mind, he felt that invisible hand, the one that had been a guide for so long, now pulling him back. If Eli gave Victor over to Stell, over to Eon, they would take him alive, put him in a cell. No, Eli would not, could not, allow those half measures. Victor was too dangerous. He had to be put down, and Stell had already failed once. Eli wouldn't entrust the task to him a second time. The lights came up, the far wall went clear, and the director stormed into sight, dressed in a tailored black suit, his tie loose at the throat.
"What the hell?"
demanded Stell.
"You better have something groundbreaking after that stunt."
Eli faltered for only a second, then straightened, committed to his course. "Actually," he said coldly, "I hit a dead end." It wasn't a lie. Suspicion flickered across Stell's face.
"That's surprising, given how you've spent the last week. You seem to be making strides."
Eli swore inwardly. He'd been so stunned by the discovery, so eager for the confrontation, and so startled by his own recanting, he hadn't considered the ramifications of changing his mind. The whiplash. A break in the pattern.
"Where did it fall apart?" pressed Stell.
"It hasn't," said Eli. "I just don't have any more leads."
"Then why the fuck did you call for me?"
demanded the director. Eli had made a mistake. He wasn't prone to making mistakes, except where Victor Vale was concerned. Victor had always possessed the unnerving ability to get under Eli's skin, interrupt his focus. And now Eli needed to disrupt Stell's own, find a way to redirect his attention, twist suspicion into something easier. Anger. That was such a loud emotion. "I guess," said Eli, infusing his voice with as much derision as he could muster, "I wanted to see what you would do. Now I know." Stell looked at him, mouth open in surprise, and then, predictably, it crumpled into fury.
"Do you want me to send you back to the lab?"
"That threat is beginning to feel stale." Stell drew back, as if struck.
"Is it?" he said darkly. "Allow me to refresh your memory."
Eli tensed as Stell raised his wristwatch to his mouth and spoke into a hidden comm, the words too low for him to hear. "Wait," started Eli, his voice cut off by a metallic scrape overhead. 4 small sprinklers emerged from the ceiling at the front of the cell. Icy water rained down, soaking Eli through in seconds. He started to back up, but Stell's voice made him stop.
"Don't you dare retreat."
Eli held his ground. "Fine." He looked down at his hands, then up at Stell. "I won't melt."
"I know,"
said the director grimly. Eli barely heard the hum over the sound of the water. He realized too late what was happening, managed just to step toward the fiberglass before the current hit him. It was everywhere, tearing up his legs, arcing through his chest, lighting every nerve. Eli buckled to his hands and knees as the electricity tore through him, conducted through the water. Enough volts to level a small beast, but Eli's own regeneration kept him conscious, caught in a suspended state of electrocution. His jaw locked, a low animal sound tearing between his teeth. Stell turned and stormed away, his hand lifting in an almost dismissive motion. The wall went solid, white, and several terrible lurching seconds later, the current finally died. Eli collapsed to his side on the slick floor as the sprinklers slowed and stopped. He rolled onto his back, chest heaving. And then, slowly, Eli got up and crossed to the desk, sinking into the chair before the computer. Since the system was twinned with Stell's, the director would be able to pull up everything, be able to read the lines, if not the space between them. Eli began to query other deaths, other causes, other leads. He couldn't bury the search that led him to Adam Porter, that missing link. But he could keep Stell from following the clean pattern of Eli's own thoughts. With every subsequent search, Eli frayed the thread, ventured down a course he'd earlier abandoned. Hopefully, It would read as frustration with his own failure, a furious need to find the truth. But as his fingers flew over the keyboard, creating a tangled web of false leads and dead ends, his own thoughts coalesced into a single, smooth train. Eli would save Victor for himself. Roman numeral 24. 4 weeks ago. Eon. Eli had spent the better part of an hour listening to Stell talk about his new target, Marcella Riggins, mob wife turned murderess. He flipped through the pages in the file as the director spoke, setting aside the newspaper clipping and the Eon-issued backstory, focusing instead on the crime scene stills from the hospital, the bed with its rusted bar, its ruined sheets, and the much more striking hole in the hospital room wall.
Nearly died in a fire. Seems to be burning everything, and everyone she can get her hands on.
She's not burning them, said Eli, skimming the photos.
The piles of ash beg to differ.
Eli traced a finger along the hole in the wall, then flipped to the crime scene close-up of the debris on the kitchen floor. He rose and pressed the photo against the fiberglass. Do you see that? The edges of the diamond? Stell squinted.
It looks dirty, which would make sense, considering it's sitting in a pile of human remains.
It's not dirty, said Eli. It's graphite.
I don't follow.
Obviously. Marcella isn't burning things. She's eroding them. If she'd been using heat, you might have been able to combat it with extreme cold. But with a corrosive ability like this, you're better off killing her. Stell crossed his arms.
Is that the only advice you have to offer?
In this case, it's certainly the best, said Eli. He had seen power like Marcella's before. Raw, destructive, boundless. There was no place for power like that in this world. She would carve a swath of chaos until she was put down. Do you know the half-life of carbon?
Off the top of my head,
asked Stell. It's nearly 6,000 years. How long do you think it took her to kill the person wearing that diamond? How long do you think it will take her to penetrate whatever armor your men are wearing?
It won't be the first time our agents have gone up against someone with a touch-based ability.
And assuming you capture her, do you even have a cell capable of containing someone with these powers?
Every power has its limits.
Just listen.
I don't need to,
cut in Stell.
Your philosophy is hardly a mystery at this point, Eli. If it were up to you, Eon would never salvage anyone.
It's in part because of me that you have salvaged the last 22 EOs. So listen when I tell you that someone this powerful belongs in the ground.
You know the policy.
I know you want to believe that all EOs are worth saving, but we aren't.
We don't decide who lives and who dies, said Stell tersely. We don't condemn EOs without confrontation.
Now who's letting their ideals cloud their judgment?
Marcella will be offered the same opportunity as every other EO we engage, to come willingly. If she refuses, and the on-site team is unable to safely, snarled Eli.
This woman can reduce people to ash with a single touch. She can decay metal and stone. Do you value an EO's life above a human's? Because you are sending your agents on a suicide mission to sate your pride.
Stand down, said Stell.
Eli exhaled through clenched teeth. If you don't kill her now, you'll wish you had. Stell turned to go.
If you have no other suggestions,
send me. Stell glanced back, raising a thick brow.
What was that?
You want other options, ones that won't get innocent humans killed. Eli spread his arms. Our abilities are complementary. She ruins. I regenerate. There's a cosmic elegance to it, don't you think?
And what if her power is faster? Asked Stell.
Eli's arms fell back to his sides. Then I die, he said simply. Once upon a time, he had believed he survived because God willed it, that Eli was unbreakable because he had a purpose for him. These days, Eli didn't know what he believed, but he still hoped, fervently, desperately, that there was a reason for it. Stell smiled grimly.
I appreciate the offer, Mr. Cardale, but I'm not letting you go that easily.
The wall went solid, swallowing the director from sight. Eli sighed and crossed to his bed. He sank down onto his cot, elbows on his knees, fingers laced, head bowed, as if in prayer. Eli hadn't expected Stell to say yes, of course, but he had planted the seed, had seen it take root behind Stell's eyes. Now, he simply had to wait for it to grow. Roman numeral 25. 4 years ago. Eon, laboratory wing. Thomas Haverty was a man of vision. So he wasn't at all surprised when Stell stripped him of his post at Eon, wasn't surprised when security escorted him from the lab, took his access card, his files, his crisp white coat. So many men of genius were stymied by short-sighted fools, scientists condemned before they were lauded, gods crucified before they were worshipped. "This way, Mr. Haverty," said a soldier in a black suit.
Doctor,
He corrected as he stepped through the scanner, spread his arms, and let them search his clothes, his skin, his skeleton, all to make sure he hadn't stolen anything from the lab, as if Haverty would do something so obvious, so stupid. They escorted him all the way to the parking lot, and proceeded to search his car, too, before returning his keys and signaling the security post to let him out. The gates slid closed behind him with grim finality. Haverty drove the 24 miles back to the outer edge of Merritt, to a small apartment on the southern side of the city. He let himself in, set the keys in their designated tray, peeled off his coat and shoes, and rolled up his sleeves. A few stray flecks of Mr. Cardale's blood still stained the inside of his wrist, beyond the protection of his latex gloves. Haverty considered the dots for a moment, the strange pattern like a smattering of stars, a constellation waiting to be discovered. He held his wrist out and went to his office, a windowless room, sterile and white, and lined with refrigerated shelves of samples, vials of blood, small glass jars containing a dozen different drugs, folder after folder of hand-copied notes. No, Haverty hadn't been foolish enough to steal from Eon on his way out. Instead, he'd done it every day, stolen his research one piece at a time. A single sample, a slide, an ampule, each token small enough to be claimed an accident if he'd been caught. A slip of the mind. Patience really was the highest virtue, and progress was a thing achieved one halting step at a time. Every night or morning when he'd returned home, Haverty had taken up a notepad and reprinted word for word the notes he'd made in the sanctum of the Eon compound. Men ahead of their time were always, by definition, outside of it. Haverty was no different. Stell couldn't see, Eon couldn't see, but he knew that the ends would justify the means. He would show them. He would crack the extraordinary code and change the face of science, and they would welcome him back. They would worship him. He crossed the lab and drew a small glass slide from a top drawer, along with a scalpel, delicately scraping flecks of Elliot Cardale's brown-red blood onto the surface. He had so much work to do. Roman numeral 26. 4 weeks ago. Southern Merritt. Nick Falsetti sank onto the bench beside the block of lockers and began unwinding the tape from his hands. He ran his tongue along his inside cheek. He could still taste the tang of blood where his opponent had landed a punch. The last of the tape came free, and Nick flexed, watching the skin on his knuckles tighten, harden to something like stone. It wasn't stone, of course, or anything else. It was more like all the softness went out of him, all the weakness erased. He flexed again, his fingers gaining a sudden flush of color as they softened back into flesh and bone. Nick could only harden himself in pieces, hands, ribs, shins, jaw, and even then it was a conscious thing. But it was a hell of a thing. He'd heard the whispers of the soldiers who came looking for people like him, had gone down the online rabbit hole, dug up everything he could on extraordinaries in those first few days before he realized that was probably a giant red flag, and switched to incognito searches on public computers. Eon. That's what they were called. He kept picturing them like the people on TV shows, the ones who believed in ghosts or monsters or aliens. Nick had never been gullible. He didn't really think they existed, these hunters. But then again, up until 6 months ago, when Nick, fresh out of the hospital, put his hand through a wall, and the wall was the only thing that broke, he hadn't believed in people like him either. The bookie, Tavish, whistled from the doorway, a fresh toothpick between his teeth.
For a guy your size, you sure can throw a punch.
His chin bobbed toward the hall, the room, the ring.
Bigger stages than this, you know.
You want me gone? Asked Nick.
I didn't say that,
said Tavish, shifting the toothpick in his mouth.
Just saying. You ever looking to go big? I could help you. For a cut.
I'm not looking for more attention, said Nick. Just cash.
Suit yourself.
The envelope arced through the air, landing on the bench beside him. It wasn't all that thick, but it was untraceable, and more than enough to get by until the next fight, which was all Nick needed.
See you in 3 nights,
said Tavish, disappearing down the hall. Nick thumbed through the cash, then tucked it in his coat and headed out. The alley light above the door was on the fritz again. The alley, a tangle of shadows, the kind that played tricks on your eyes this late at night. Nick lit a cigarette, the red tip dancing before him in the dark. There was a rager going on in one of the nearby warehouses, the heavy pulse of the club's bass blanketing the streets. Nick couldn't hear his own heart over the beat, let alone the footsteps coming up behind him. Didn't know someone was there, until the sudden flash of pain pierced his side. It caught him off guard, and for a second Nick thought he'd been shot, but when he looked down he saw, jutting between his ribs, a short metal dart, an empty vial. He rounded, dizzy, expecting to see a cop or a thug, or even an Eon soldier, but there was only a single man, short and balding, wearing round glasses and a white lab coat. That was the last thing Nick saw before his vision blurred, and his legs buckled, and everything went dark. Nick came to in a steel room. A shipping crate, or maybe a storage locker, he couldn't tell. His vision slid in and out of focus, his head pounding. Memory flickered back. The dart. The vial. He tried to move, and felt the pull of restraints around his wrists and ankles, the rustle of plastic sheeting beneath his head. Nick flexed, hardening his wrists. But it was no use. Solidity wasn't the same as strength. The bonds had just enough give. They didn't snap. He fought, then, thrashing against the table, until someone clicked their tongue.
"How quickly we devolve,"
said a voice behind his head.
"People become animals the moment they are caged."
Nick twisted, craning, until he caught the edge of a white coat.
"I apologize for the state of my lab,"
said the voice.
"It's not ideal, I know, but science doesn't bow to aesthetics." "Who the fuck are you?"
demanded Nick, twisting desperately against the restraints. The white coat approached the table and became a man, thin, balding, with round glasses and deep-set eyes the color of slate.
"My name,"
said the man, adjusting latex gloves,
"is Dr. Haverty."
Something glinted in his hand, thin and silver and sharp. A scalpel.
"I promise what's about to happen is in the interest of progress."
The man leaned in, bringing his blade to rest above Nick's left eye. The point came into perfect focus, close enough to brush his lashes, while the doctor slid into a blur of white beyond. Nick gritted his teeth and tried to retreat out of the scalpel's path, but there was nowhere to go. So instead he forced all his focus into hardening his left eye. The scalpel came to rest against it with the plink of metal on ice. The blur of the doctor's face parted into a smile.
"Fascinating."
The scalpel vanished, and the doctor retreated from view. Nick heard the scrape and shuffle of tools, and then Haverty reappeared, holding a syringe, its contents a vivid, viscous blue.
"What do you want?"
pleaded Nick, as the needle disappeared from sight. Seconds later, a pain pierced the base of his skull. Cold began to flood his limbs.
"What do I want?"
echoed Haverty, as Nick shivered, shuddered, spasmed.
"What all men of science want. To learn."
3. Ascension. Roman numeral 1. 3 weeks ago. Eon.
"What about you, Rush?"
Dominic blinked. He was sitting at a table on the upper level of the canteen, Holtz on one side and Barra on the other. After getting Dom the job, Holtz had stayed close, helping him fit in at Eon. A cheerful blonde kid, Dom couldn't help but think of him that way, even though Holtz was a year older, with a mischievous smile and a perpetually good mood. They'd served together 2 tours before Dom stepped on an IED and found himself retired. It was nice to have a shared shift break, Barra's presence notwithstanding. Rios sat alone 1 table over the way she always did, a book open beside her food. Every time a soldier passed too close, she shot them a look, and they retreated. "What about me?" asked Dom.
"If you were an EO,"
said Barra, around a mouthful of sandwich,
"what would your power be?"
It was an innocuous question, inevitable even, given the environment, but Dom's mouth still went dry. "I don't know."
"Oh, come on," pressed Barra. "You can't tell me you haven't thought of it."
"I'd want X-ray vision," said Holtz, "or the ability to fly, or the ability to transform my car into other cars whenever I get bored." Rios looked up from her own table. "Your mind," she said, "truly is a marvel." Holtz beamed, as if it were a compliment. "But," she continued, "if you bothered to read the eval files, you know that an EO's power is tethered to the method of their NDE and the state of their mind at the time of incident. So tell me," she said, turning in her chair, "what kind of accident gets you the power to change the model of your car?" Holtz made a comical frown, as if genuinely trying to puzzle it out, but Barra was clearly bored.
"What about you, Rios?"
he shot back.
"What would your power be?"
She returned to her book. "I'd settle for the ability to create quiet." Holtz let out a nervous laugh. Dominic let his eyes slide over the group. He hadn't expected it to get easier, hadn't wanted it to get easier. But it had. That was the thing. It was amazing what you could get used to, how quickly the strange became mundane, the extraordinary normal. After leaving the army, he'd missed the camaraderie, the common ground. Hell, he'd missed the uniforms, the orders, the sense of routine. What Dominic could never get used to were Eon's cells, or rather the people kept inside them. The complex's crisp white walls had become familiar, the obscure maze reduced to clean lines of rote muscle memory. But there would never be anything comfortable about the purpose of this place. If Dom ever found himself forgetting the building's true design, all he had to do was look at the surveillance footage, click through the images of 36 holding cells. Now and then when Dom drew rounds, he had to walk those cells, deliver meals, listen to the EOs beyond the fiberglass beg for him to let them out. Sometimes when he drew eval, he had to sit across from them, the prisoners in their cells, and Dominic in his camouflage as human. and asked them about their lives, their deaths, their memories, their minds. He had to pretend he didn't understand what they meant when they talked about those final moments, the desperate thoughts that followed them down into the dark, the ones that pulled them back out. Across the table, Holtz and Barra were still tossing around hypothetical powers, and Rios had gone back to her book. But Dominic stared down at his food, his appetite suddenly gone. Roman numeral 2. 2 years ago. Dominic's apartment. He turned the business card over in his hands, waiting for Victor to call him back. The black ink caught the light, illuminating the 3 letters. Eon. 10 minutes later, the phone finally rang.
Take the job.
Dominic froze. You're not serious. But he could tell by the ensuing silence that Victor was. These are the guys that hunt us, capture us, kill us. And you want me to work for them? You have the background, the qualifications, and if they peg me as an EO? A short, impatient sigh.
You have the ability to step outside of time, Dominic, if you can't avoid capture.
I can step out of time, said Dominic, but I can't walk through walls. I can't open locks. Dom ran a hand through his hair. With all due respect,
that saying usually precedes a no, said Victor coolly.
What you're asking me to do,
I'm not asking.
Victor was 100 miles away, but still, Dominic flinched at the threat. He owed Victor everything, and they both knew it. All right. Victor hung up, and Dom stared at the phone for a long time before he turned the card over and dialed. A black van came for him at dawn. Dominic had been waiting on the curb, watched as a man in street clothes climbed out and opened the back doors. Dom forced himself forward. His steps were slow, a body operating against drag. He didn't want to do this. Every self-preserving nerve in his body was saying no. He didn't know what Victor was thinking, or how many steps ahead he was thinking it. In Dom's head, Victor went around acting like the world was one big game of chess, tapping people and saying, "You're a pawn, you're a knight, you're a rook." Dom chafed a little at the thought. But then he'd learned not to ask questions in the army, to trust the orders as they came down, knowing that he couldn't see the whole scope. War needed both kinds of people, those who played the long game and those who played the short one. Victor was the former. Dominic was the latter. That didn't make him a pawn. It made him a good soldier. He willed his body toward the van. But before he could climb in, the man held out a Ziploc bag.
Phone, watch, anything that transmits data and isn't hardwired to your body.
Dominic had been careful. There were only a handful of numbers in his phone, and none of them named. Victor was Boss Man, Mitch was Big Man, Sid was Tiny Terror. But he still felt a nervous prickle as the bag disappeared, and he was ushered into the van. It wasn't empty. 4 other people, 3 men and 1 woman, were already sitting inside, their backs against the windowless metal walls. Dom took a seat as the doors slammed and the van pulled away. No one spoke, but he could tell the others were military, or ex-military, by the set of their shoulders, their close-cropped or tightly wound hair, the steady blankness in their faces. One had a prosthetic arm, an elaborate piece of biotech from the elbow down, and Dom watched the man's mechanical fingers tap absently on his leg. There was one more pickup, a young black woman, and then the ground changed under the tires, the world outside drowned out by the engine as the van gained speed. Dom had spent half his career in convoys like this, being transported from one base to another. One of the men went to check his watch before remembering it had been confiscated. Dominic didn't mind. He could wait. Time moved strangely for Dom. Or at least, he moved strangely in time. On paper, he was only 33, but he felt like he'd been alive for longer, and he guessed that, in a way, he had. Dom could step out of the flow of time, into the shadows, where the whole world became a painting in shades of gray, a dark between, a nowhere, where he was the only thing that moved. Dom had never done the math, but he figured that he'd probably spent weeks if not months on the other side, the outside, his own timeline stretching out or losing shape. Once, as an experiment, he had stepped into the shadows and stayed there, curious to know how long he could last out of time. It was like holding your breath, and at the same time it wasn't. There was oxygen in the space between, but there was also weight, pressure, a pressure that had nearly broken him before, when every step was pain. A pressure that now registered as drag, challenging but by no means impermeable. Since then, every morning and every night, Dominic spent time out of time. Sometimes he only moved around his apartment, and sometimes he went further afield, measuring the ground he could cover, instead of the seconds that passed. As the transport van slowed, Dom's attention was pulled back to the metal bench, the darkened hull, the other waiting bodies. A few minutes later, it finally came to a stop. The doors opened, and they were ushered out onto smooth asphalt. Dominic squinted, disoriented by the sudden morning light. They were standing in front of a building that had to be Eon. From the outside, it looked innocuous, bland, even. There was a perimeter wall, but no barbed wire, no obvious gunner posts. The group reached the front doors, which parted with the hiss of an airlock. The lobby, if you could call it a lobby, was sleek and open, but between the front doors and that space was a security port. One by one, the 6 were called forward by name and instructed to empty their pockets and step into the scanner. Klinberg, Matthews, Linfield. Dominic's pulse quickened. Barra. Plinetti. Victor had said they couldn't hold him, but he didn't know that. Not for sure. These people, their entire job was capturing people like him. Surely their technology had been adapted to that task. What if they'd found a way to measure the difference between a human and EOs? What if they could detect people like him? Rusher, said an officer, ushering Dominic forward. He let out a low breath and stepped into the scan. An error sound, a ringing alarm, echoed through the lobby. Dom staggered backward out of the scan, braced for the walls to open and black-clad soldiers to come pouring in. He was ready to step out of the world and into the shadows, ready to forfeit his identity, his anonymity, the whole fucking thing, and face Victor's wrath. But the officer only rolled his eyes. You got parts? What? Asked Dominic, dazed. Metal. In your body. You gotta specify that kind of thing before you go in. The soldier briskly typed in a new set of commands. Okay, now go. Dom forced himself to step back in, praying the scan couldn't pick up his panic. Hold still. He felt like he was being Xeroxed. A bright band of white light tracked up and then back down his body. Step out. Dominic did, fighting to stop the tremor from showing in his limbs. One of the other guys, Barra, clamped a hand on his shoulder. Geez, man, how tight are you wound? Dom managed a nervous chuckle. Not much for loud noises, he said. Blame an IED. Bad luck, man. The grip loosened. But they put you back together well? Dom nodded. Well enough. They were led to a room with no chairs, nowhere to sit, no signs of comfort at all. Just bare walls, empty floor. The door swung shut behind them, and locked. You think it's a test? Asked one of the women, Plinetti, after 30 minutes. If so, it's a shit one, said Matthews, stretching out on the floor. It'll take more than a white box to fuck with me. Dom rocked on his heels, shoulders tipping back against the wall. Could use some coffee, said Barra with a yawn. The last guy, Klinberg, spoke up. Hey, he said in a mock whisper. You ever seen one? One what? Asked the other woman, Linfield. You know, what they keep here? What? He'd said. Not who. Dom resisted the urge to correct him as the door swung open and a female soldier walked in. She was tall and lean, with warm brown skin and short black hair. Most of the recruits sprang to their feet. Attention was a hard habit to break. But the guy on the ground rose slowly, almost lazily. I'm Agent Rios, said the soldier, and I'll be leading you through today's orientation. She strode the length of the room. Some of you are wondering what we do here. Eon is separated into containment, observation, and neutralization. Containment teams are dedicated to the location, pursuit, and capture of EOs. Observation of those EOs is stationed here, at the base. Klinberg raised his hand. Which team gets to kill them? Dominic's chest tightened, but Rios's expression didn't falter. Neutralization is a last resort, and its teams are built from those who have proven themselves in other departments. Safe to say, Klinberg, you won't be killing EOs anytime soon. If that's a deterrent for you, let me know, so I can address the remaining 5 candidates without your distraction. Klinberg had the sense to shut up. Before we begin, continued Rios, you're about to sign a non-disclosure agreement. If you break it, you will not be arrested, you will not be sued. She smiled grimly. You will simply disappear. A tablet was passed around, and one by one they pressed their thumbs against the screen. Once it was back in Rios's hands, the soldier continued speaking. Most of you have heard the term EO, and most of you are probably skeptical, but the fastest way to disabuse you of doubt is through a demonstration. The doors opened at her back. Follow me. Keep your hands inside the ride, whispered Klinberg as they filed into the hall. Remember this place, thought Dominic as he fell in line. Remember everything. But it was a maze of white, sterile and uniform and disorienting. They passed through several sets of doors, each sealed, requiring a swipe from Agent Rios's keycard. Hey, whispered Barra. I heard they have that killer here. The one that offed like 100 other EOs. You think it's true? Dom didn't answer. Was Eli really somewhere in this building? Agent Rios tapped a comm on her shoulder. Cell 8, status?
Irritable,
answered the person on the other end. A grim smile crossed her lips. Perfect. She swiped them through a final door, and Dominic felt his heart lurch. They were in a hangar, empty except for a freestanding cell in the center of the room. It was a cube made of fiberglass, and trapped inside, like a firefly in a jar, was a woman. She knelt in the middle of the floor, wearing a kind of jumpsuit, its fabric glossy as if coated. "Tabitha," said Agent Rios, her voice even. "Let me out." The recruits moved around the cube, as if she were a piece of art, or a specimen, something to be considered from every side. Matthews even rapped his knuckles on the glass, as if he were at a zoo.
"Don't feed the animals,"
he muttered under his breath. Dominic felt sick. The prisoner rose to her feet. "Let me out." "Ask nicely," said Rios. The prisoner was beginning to glow, the light coming from beneath her skin, a deep red-orange like heated metal. "Let me out!" she screamed, her voice crackling. And then she ignited. Flame licked up her skin, engulfing her from head to toe, her hair standing up in a plume of blue-white light, like the tip of a match. Several of the recruits recoiled. One covered his mouth. Others stared in fascination, surprise, fear. Dominic feigned shock, but the fear was real. It crept through his limbs. A warning, that old gut feeling that said wrong, 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 just like it had the second before Dom's foot hit the IED, the instant before his world changed forever. A fear that had less to do with the woman on fire and more to do with the cell holding her, the heat that didn't even penetrate the foot-thick fiberglass. Rios hit a switch on the wall, and sprinklers went off inside the cell, followed by the sizzle of a doused fire. The cube filled with steam, and when the water cut off and the white smoke cleared, the prisoner sat in a heap on the floor of the cell, soaking wet and heaving for breath. "All right," said Rios. "Show and tell's over." She turned toward the recruits. "Any questions?" The black van was waiting at the end of the day. All the way back to the city, the other recruits chatted, making small talk. But Dom closed his eyes and focused on his breathing. The demonstration had been followed by an interview, an explanation of training protocol, a psych eval, each procedure executed in a way so grounded, so ordinary, that they'd been clearly designed to make candidates forget the strangeness of Eon's purpose. But Dominic couldn't forget. He was still shaken from the sight of the woman on fire, and certain that he'd never get out with his secret intact. So he was surprised and suspicious when, at the end of it all, Rios told him to report back the next day for further training. Dom closed his eyes as the van sped on. One by one it stopped, and the others were deposited outside their homes. One by one, until he was the only one left. And as the van doors slammed shut on him, and him alone, Dom was gripped anew by panic. He was sure that he could feel freeway moving beneath the tires, sure that they were taking him back to Eon, to his own fiberglass cube. "Rusher." Dominic looked up and realized that the van was idling, the back doors open, his apartment building visible beyond in the dusky light. The soldier handed Dom the Ziploc bag containing his phone, and Dom got out. But as he climbed the steps and went inside, he couldn't shake the feeling he was being watched. There, on the street, an unfamiliar car. He switched the TV on, returned to the window. It was still there, idling. Dom changed into workout clothes, took a deep breath, and slipped out of time. The world went silent and heavy and gray. All the sound and movement leached out of the room. Dom made his way to the front door, fighting against the drag of frozen time. Back when every step was pain, Dom couldn't bear to spend more than a few moments in this heavy, dark place. But, after months of training, his limbs and lungs moved steadily, if not easily, against the resistance. He descended the stairs, his steps soundless when earlier they had echoed, through the front doors and onto the curb. Dom paused beside the unfamiliar car and bent to examine the figure in the driver's seat, a cell half raised to their ear. The man had the look of ex-Mill, and the file on the seat beside him was printed with Dominic's name. He looked back and up at his apartment, the glow of the TV a splash of light against the curtains. Then he turned and walked 2 blocks to the nearest subway. Halfway down the stairs, he stepped back out of the shadows and into the world, into light and color and time, and vanished into the evening commute. "They're watching my place," he said when Victor answered the phone. He was jogging through a small park, his breath coming in short, even beats. "I'd expect as much," said Victor, unfazed. Dom slowed to a walk. "Why am I doing this?" "Because ignorance is only bliss if you want to get caught." With that, Victor hung up. Dominic returned to Eon the next day, via the black van, to find the initial group of 6 reduced to 5. No Klinberg. By the 3rd day, Matthews was gone too. Rios led them through exercises, drills, tests, and Dom did exactly as he was told. Tried to keep his head down and his expression blank, and still he expected to be cut. Wanted to be cut. He was heading back to the van on the 3rd day when he was stopped by Rios. "Director Stell would like a word." Dominic stiffened. He'd never met the man, but he knew Stell's reputation. Knew he was the detective who sent Victor to prison back in college. The man who tracked Eli to Merit. And, of course, the man who'd started Eon. Run. said a voice in Dom's head. He looked from Rios to the compound's entrance, the sliding doors hissing closed. Run before they shut. But if he did, that would be the end of it. His identity would be known, his cover blown. And then Dom would have to keep running. Always. He forced himself to fall in line. Rios led him to an office at the end of a long white hall. She knocked once and opened the door. Director Stell sat in a high-backed chair on the opposite side of a broad steel desk. He had black hair, just starting to silver, his face reduced to angles as he stared down at a tablet.
Mr. Rusher, please sit down.
Sir. Dominic sat. The door closed behind him with a click.
Something has been bothering me,
said Stell without looking up.
You ever forget something, and you can't remember what it is? It's a vicious little mind game. Distracting, too. Like an itch you can't scratch.
Stell set the tablet down, and Dominic saw his own face staring up from the screen. Not the photo taken in the security scan, or the one pulled from hall surveillance. No, the photo was a few years old, from his time in the service.
It was your name,
continued Stell.
I knew I'd heard it before, but I couldn't remember where.
Stell turned the tablet and nudged it across the steel table.
Do you know what that is?
Dominic scanned the screen. Beside his photo was a kind of profile, basic details, age, birthday, parents, along with facts about his life, address, schooling, etc. But there was an error. Dominic's middle name was listed here as Elliston. His real middle name was Alexander.
Have you heard of Eli Ever?
Asked Stell. Dom stilled, searching for the right answer, the right amount of knowledge. It had been public news, but how much of it and which pieces? He'd only met Eli once, and only for an instant. The breath it took to step into the Falcon Price and pull Sydney and her dog out. The serial killer? Ventured Dom. Stell nodded.
Elliot Cardale, known as Eli Ever in the press, was one of the most dangerous extraordinaries in existence. He killed nearly 40 people, and briefly used the Merritt police databases, and the police force for that matter, to create a list of targets, profiles of those he suspected to be EOs. This, said Stell slowly, is one of those profiles.
Once, when Dominic was overseas, he'd walked into a room and found a live bomb. Not like the IED he'd stepped on. No, he'd never had time to see that explosion coming. But the bomb in this room had been as big as a steel drum, and the whole place was booby-trapped around it. He remembered looking down, seeing the trigger wire, barely an inch in front of his left boot. Dom had wanted nothing more than to run away, as far as possible, but he hadn't known where the other wires were, or even how he'd made it that far without triggering them. He'd had to pick his way out, one agonizing step at a time. And here he was again, his footing precarious. One wrong move, and everything would blow. You're asking if I'm an EO? Stell's gaze was steady, unflinching.
We have no way of knowing if every person Eli targeted was actually.
Dominic slammed the tablet down on the table. I gave my flesh and blood and bones to this country. I gave everything I had to this country. I almost died for this country. And I didn't get any special powers out of it. I wish I had. Instead, I got a body full of scrap parts and a lot of pain. But I'm still here, still doing what I can, because I want to keep people safe. Now, if you don't want to hire me, that's your choice. But have the balls to make up a better reason than this. Sir. Dominic sat back, breathless, hoping the outburst had been enough to convince the other man. The silence stretched out. And then, at last, Stell nodded and said,
We'll be in touch.
Dismissed, Dom rose from his chair and left. He went into the men's room across the hall, and into the safety of a stall, before vomiting up everything in his stomach. Roman numeral 3. 3 weeks ago. Eon. Barra smacked his palm on the table and got up. Hate to eat and run, he said, but I've got a mission.
No way, said Holtz. They cleared you for field work?
He turned on Rios.
What gives? I've been petitioning for weeks to get on containment.
Barra smoothed his uniform. It's because I'm such an asset. Rios snorted.
It's because you're totally useless here.
Barra put a hand to his heart as if wounded, then shot back. What about you?
What about me?
You don't do field work. She met his gaze, her gray eyes flat.
Someone has to make sure the monsters don't get out.
Dom was surprised. He'd been there for 2 years, and witnessed a handful of attempts. An EO managed to put a hole in one of the fiberglass walls. Another tore free from restraints during a routine med check. But he'd never heard of an actual escape. Has an EO ever gotten out? Rios's mouth twitched at the corner.
People don't get out of Eon, Rusher. Not once we put them here. People.
Rios was one of the only soldiers who referred to the EOs that way. Who are you hunting? Asked Holtz, who'd carefully resigned himself to living vicariously. Some crazy housewife, said Barra. Burns holes and shit. Found her husband's secret apartment at the Heights. Holtz, who had had many girlfriends, shook his head. Never underestimate an angry woman.
Never underestimate a woman, amended Rios.
Barra shrugged. Yeah. Place your bets. Poke your fun. But when she's rotting in a cell, you're all buying me drinks. Meanwhile, in Merritt. June closed her eyes and listened to the rain beat against her black umbrella. She wished she were in a field somewhere, arms spread wide to catch the thunder, instead of standing on the curb outside the sleek urban high-rise. She had been waiting for nigh on 10 minutes before someone finally came through the revolving doors, and just her luck. He was all paunch in an ill-fitting suit, complete with 5 o'clock shadow and a comb-over. June sighed. Beggars couldn't be choosers, she supposed. She started toward the building, brushing past the man at the corner. The barest touch, the kind that goes unnoticed amid the jostle and drip of a rainy day, and she had all she needed. He was on his way and she was on hers. She didn't bother changing, not until she reached the Heights' front doors. An older man sat behind a concierge desk in the lobby. Forget something, Mr. Gusterly? June made a short, gruff sound and muttered, Always. The elevator doors opened, and by the time they closed behind her, the reflection in the polished metal was hers again. Well, not hers, but the one she'd started with that morning. Peasant skirt and a leather jacket rolled to the elbows, a sly smile, and hair that fell in loose brown curls. She'd picked it off the subway like a girl shopping the racks. It was one of her favorites. As the elevator rose, she pulled out her cell and texted Sid. For a long moment, nothing. And then, 3 dots appeared beside the girl's name to show that she was typing. June watched, restless for an answer. When it came to Sydney, she'd never been good at waiting. Roman numeral 4. 3 years ago. Capital City. It had taken an entire year for June to find them again, and when she did, it was entirely by accident, almost as if it were fate. The trouble was, June didn't believe in fate. At least she didn't want to believe in it, because fate meant everything happened for a reason, and there were too many things she wished never had. Besides, it was hard to believe in a higher power or a grand design when you killed people for a living. But then fate, or luck, or whatever it was, went and handed her Sydney. A year of looking for the man in black, with no luck, and then 1,500 miles from Dresden, where they'd first crossed paths. June cut through a park on the way to a job, and saw the blonde girl again. A year, but it was impossibly, undeniably her. She had been, and seemed to be, at that age where changes happened overnight. Bodies grew inches, curves, but the girl looked the same. Exactly the same. Same blonde bob and ice-blue eyes. Same narrow build. Same giant black dog waiting like a shadow at her side. June scanned the park. There was no sign of the man in black, but she glimpsed the other one sitting in the grass, tattoos wrapped around his forearms and a book open on his knee. She saw a flash of pink nearby, a forgotten frisbee. She picked it up, spun it between her fingers, and then lobbed the plastic disc at the man's head. It connected with a light crack, and June jogged up to him, a bouncy young brunette, all apologies and sunshine.
It's all right,
he said, rubbing the back of his head.
Takes more than a frisbee to knock me over.
He offered it back, and when her fingers brushed his life flickered through her, like a film reel. He was so open, so human. Mitch Turner, 43, foster homes and skinned knees and bloody knuckles in a street brawl, computer screens and car tires screeching, handcuffs and a prison cell and a cafeteria, a man with a makeshift knife, a muffled threat, and then June saw a face she recognized. And thanks to Mitch, she now had a name to go with it. Victor Vale. In Mitch's mind, the man was lean but not yet gaunt, washed out in prison grays instead of fitted blacks. A flick of his wrist, and another man who threatened collapsed with a scream. That meeting, like a hinge in Mitch's mind, beyond that moment, his memories were all marked by Victor's blue eyes, his pale hair,